For everyone who was born and lived in the Soviet Union, February 23rd is a special date, the most masculine day of the year. Over more than a century, it has changed its name several times. At first, it was the Day of the Workers' and Peasants' Red Army, then the Soviet Army Day, and after the collapse of the Soviet Union, it became the Defender of the Fatherland Day, a non-working holiday. In this form, it is still celebrated today in Russia, Belarus, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Abkhazia, and Transnistria. Until 2014, February 23 was also an official holiday in Ukraine. But after the annexation of Crimea and Russian aggression in Donbass, it faded into oblivion. Today, Ukrainians honor their defenders, both men and women, on October 14th on the Feast of the Intercession of the Holy Virgin, which is also the day the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, UPA, was founded. And that's right, because villains who killed and tortured Ukrainians on a mass scale should not be glorified in Ukraine. However, my story is not about that. Today we will talk about where this holiday actually came from in the Soviet calendar. Why was Armed Forces Day celebrated on February 23 in the USSR? What significant event happened on this day? So relax and watch the video until the end. We'll break down probably the most shameless of the Soviet myths. I'll tell you what really happened on this day, more than a century ago. My name is Semyon. This is the Mega Show TV channel. Let's get started. What did they say about February 23rd in the Soviet Union? First, as usual, let's recall the classic version of the myth. In the Soviet Union, they talked about it simply. They said that it was on February 23, 1918 that the newly formed Red Army defeated the advancing German troops near Pskov and Narva, thus eliminating the threat to Petrograd, the cradle of the revolution. It should be noted that this interpretation of the events appeared quite late, only in the second half of the 1930s. Before that, people tried to justify the date by referring to Lenin's decree on the creation of the Red Army. Let's go back to those days and find out what was happening. The background of the events. The beginning of 1918, a truly terrifying time. By this time, the vast country, drained by 4 years of World War and having gone through 2 revolutions, was rapidly heading toward internal turmoil. There was a virtual absence of authority, and the collapse of state institutions led to chaos and anarchy. Destruction and famine were looming. Those dissatisfied with Bolshevik rule gathered in the south of Russia, where the White Army began to form. At the same time, negotiations continued in Brest-Litovsk between the new Bolshevik government and representatives of the Central Powers. The Soviet delegation was personally led by Lev Trotsky. He received simple and clear instructions from Lenin to stall for time. And the demon of the revolution did just that with great skill. The Bolsheviks desperately needed a ceasefire, but they didn't want to accept Germany's draconian terms. These words are attributed to Lev Davidovich. Neither war nor peace. Don't sign the treaty, disband the army. So what were they counting on? Lenin and his associates. We know what. On a swift and inevitable world revolution, which the Bolsheviks expected to happen any day. Now, of course, this seems completely absurd. But back then, the communists seriously believed that the workers of Germany and Austria-Hungary would soon rise up and overthrow their governments. And what else could the Bolsheviks hope for? They had destroyed the old Tsarist army but never managed to create a new one. Simply put, there was no one left to defend the country. But Germany had its own reasons. After the October coup in Petrograd, the Germans began transferring combat-ready units from the Eastern Front to the West, where the so-called Spring Offensive was being prepared. It was the German Empire's last chance to turn the tide of the war before the Americans arrived in Europe. Therefore, they needed to put an end to the issue with Russia, and as quickly as possible. On February 10, 1918, after several months of negotiations, Trotsky told the Germans that he did not agree to their terms and would not sign anything. In response, Germany announced the resumption of hostilities. The Operation Fist Strike began. This was the German way of forcing peace. The socialist fatherland is in danger. The Bolsheviks were typical populists who told people only what they wanted to hear. It's clear that by the 4th year of a senseless slaughter, any anti-war slogans were a huge hit with the masses. Lenin and his comrades shamelessly took advantage of this. However, that wasn't the real problem. The Bolsheviks planned to withdraw from the war and work to dismantle the Tsarist army. First, it was discredited by imperial propaganda, and after the October coup, outright demobilization began. But the Germans had no intention of stopping the war. No, of course, the Bolsheviks understood that an army was needed, but a different kind. On January 28, 1918, the Council of People's Commissars issued a decree ordering the creation of Red Guard units from revolutionary soldiers and sailors on a voluntary basis. However, such units were not very numerous, and they were not particularly combat effective. On February 18, German and Austro-Hungarian troops launched an offensive along the entire Eastern Front. They encountered almost no resistance. On the very first day of the offensive, Dvinsk was captured, Minsk on the 20th, and Polotsk on the 21st, and later Pskov, where the headquarters of the Northern Front was located, and Narva fell without a fight. There was real panic among the Bolsheviks. Usually they would scatter long before the German troops appeared. Usually just rumors about the Germans approaching were enough to make the Red Guards start running. The army fled, leaving everything behind. That's how the Bolshevik commander-in-chief Nikolai Krylenko described those days. The combined detachments turned out to be largely ineffective. There was a high rate of desertion and insubordination. Many years later, Antonov Ovsinko wrote about this in his memoirs. Colonel Peklevanov of the Tsarist army, who commanded a Red Guard detachment near Pskov, openly called his subordinates a rabble. Here's what main Bolshevik leader Vladimir Lenin wrote about the situation at that time. The painfully shameful reports about regiments refusing to hold their positions, refusing to even defend the Narva line, and not following the order to destroy everything, this is a crime. Not to mention the flight, chaos, incompetence, helplessness, and negligence. This is a quote from his article in Pravda from February 25th. It doesn't really sound like a reason for the country's main military holiday, does it? The Germans used small bombing squads for their offensive, putting them on trains and sending them eastward. This tactic turned out to be extremely effective. That same Dvinsk, for example, was captured by a German unit of just 60 to 100 men. In Rezhica, the German forces were so few that they couldn't capture the telegraph office, which continued to operate for a whole day. Only 42 Germans arrived at the Lyudzin railway station in 2 train cars. They were very tired, but since they met no resistance, the first thing they did was go to the buffet, where they had a hearty meal. Well, as for Narva, the German soldiers actually entered the city on bicycles. German General Hoffmann described those events as follows: "I have never seen such a ridiculous war. We practically fought it on trains and automobiles. You put a handful of infantry with machine guns and a single cannon on a train and ride to the next station. You take the station, arrest the Bolsheviks, and move on." The commanders behaved no better than the ordinary Red Guards. For example, to defend Narva, a detachment of Kronstadt sailors led by the People's Commissar for Naval Affairs Debenko was sent. And to make defending the city more fun, the sailors brought along 3 barrels of alcohol. Debenko introduced compulsory labor service in the city, while his subordinates engaged in their usual activities of looting and red terror. The commander locked himself in headquarters and went on a heavy drinking binge. When the Germans approached Narva, he fled so quickly that he could only be intercepted in Yamburg. To all attempts to return the commissar to the front, Debenko replied that the sailors were exhausted. For such antics, Debenko was put on trial, but then he was acquitted. A disgraceful peace. The flight of the troops and the collapse of the front threw the Bolshevik leadership into a state of real panic. As early as February 19th, Lenin telegraphed Berlin, solemnly assuring them of his readiness to accept any terms for an armistice. But now the Germans were in no hurry. It was to their advantage to continue for just a little longer, their strenuous offensive in order to strengthen their negotiating position. The pace of the Kaiser's troops' advance was 50 kilometers per day. The situation was becoming catastrophic. On February 21, Trotsky issued his famous decree, "The socialist fatherland is in danger." But that did little to help. On February 24, the Germans approached Pskov, where, in addition to the headquarters of the Northern Fleet, there were significant stockpiles of ammunition, food, and other supplies. Literally overnight, the city's defenders scattered. And by morning, the Germans calmly occupied Pskov. Now a direct threat loomed over Petrograd itself. On the morning of February 23, the Soviet government received an ultimatum from Berlin. It demanded that the Bolsheviks disarm the fleet and the army, sign a peace treaty with Ukraine, hand over vast territories to Turkey, and recognize the independence of the Baltic states and Finland. At 3 a.m. on February 24, the German ultimatum was accepted. It is said that Lenin himself insisted on this, threatening to resign otherwise. And what else could they do? If they wanted to, the Germans really could have taken Petrograd. On February 26, a decision was made to move the capital to Moscow. It all ended with the signing of the shameful Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which Lenin himself called disgraceful. That's actually putting it mildly, because under it, Russia lost vast territories in its European part. By signing the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, the Bolsheviks essentially declared Russia's defeat in World War I. And they did it at a time when Germany was only a few months away from total defeat. 4 years of war. The colossal sacrifices made by Russia were simply flushed down the drain by Lenin and his cronies. Although, on the other hand, is it really surprising? The Bolsheviks didn't care about Russia or the people who lived there. They wanted a world revolution. And finally, as you can see from my brief description of the events, nothing significant actually happened on February 23, 1918. On that day, the Germans were about 50 kilometers from Pskov and 170 kilometers from Narva. The only important event could be considered the German ultimatum, which the Soviet government ultimately had to accept. And now, after all this information, tell me, is this a good date for a holiday? The birth of a myth. Now let's talk about how and when this myth was born, and why February 23rd became the Day of the Red Army. On January 10, 1919, the chairman of the Supreme Military Inspection of the Workers' and Peasants' Red Army, Podvoisky, sent a proposal to the Presidium of the Central Executive Committee to celebrate the anniversary of the creation of the Red Army. On January 28, he wrote, "It will be 1 year since the Council of People's Commissars issued the decree on the creation of the Workers' and Peasants' Red Army." According to Podvoisky, it was this date that should be chosen for the celebration, which seemed quite logical. The Central Executive Committee considered Podvoisky's proposal only on January 23, when there were only 5 days left until the scheduled date, and it was simply impossible to prepare all the necessary events in time. Therefore, the Presidium of the Central Executive Committee issued the following decision on this matter: not to make any decisions due to the late submission of the petition and the impossibility of organizing the celebration in such a short time. On January 28, 1919, on the anniversary of the decree on the formation of the Red Army, another prominent Bolshevik, Lev Kamenev, reminded those present at a meeting of the Moscow Soviet that today was the anniversary of the Red Army. But for a number of technical reasons, the celebration was postponed to February 17. However, that day fell on a Monday. Since it was a Monday, the celebration was moved to the nearest Sunday, which was February 23. It should be noted that for the first few years, no one really remembered this date at all. Only in 1923 did it start to be widely celebrated at the state level. People quickly started looking for reasons for the chosen date, but these explanations weren't very convincing. Even Voroshilov in 1933, at a ceremonial meeting dedicated to the 15th anniversary of the Red Army, openly admitted that linking the anniversary of the Workers' and Peasants' Red Army to February 23 was rather accidental and difficult to explain, and does not coincide with historical dates. The matter was taken seriously only under Comrade Stalin in the second half of the 1930s. It is said that the rationale for tying the holiday date to a victory by Red Guard units near Pskov and Narva was personally suggested by the Soviet leader. It first appeared in an article in Izvestia on February 16, 1938. Here's a quote from there. "Near Narva and Pskov, the German occupiers were decisively repelled. Their advance toward revolutionary Petrograd was halted. The day of repelling the troops of German imperialism became the anniversary of the young Red Army." Apparently, the communists really wanted to rewrite the shame of 1918, even if only virtually. In September of the same year, similar theses were included in the short course on the history of the All-Union Communist Party, Bolsheviks. And they were published in the newspaper Pravda. After that, the defeat of the Germans near Pskov and Narva became a canonical page of Soviet history, which no one dared to dispute. In the following decades, Soviet propaganda actively promoted exactly this version. The real events only became widely known after the collapse of the USSR. A few words in conclusion. Soviet history was simply teeming with myths. However, even among them, the story of February 23rd stands out. Here, it's not just events made up out of thin air, but a real disgrace that was turned into an example of true heroism. After all, it was on February 23rd that the Bolsheviks finally accepted the terms of the German ultimatum, which later turned into the infamous Brest-Litovsk peace. But the most interesting thing, of course, is that millions of people in the post-Soviet space still celebrate this holiday, believing in its heroic origins. What can I say? It's good that Ukraine has rejected such a legacy and has started honoring its heroes according to its own traditions. Goodbye, everyone.
Пока.